All right. So this is a poem about uh, there's a certain the poem is called "There's a Certain Slant of Light," and it's by Emily Dickinson. And for those that haven't read the poem, I will, repeat it to you. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference, where the meanings are. None may teach it any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens. Shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. This poem, I never knew how much it really impacted me or really meant to me until I began to memorize the poem. And I think in many ways, when one sort of begins to memorize the poem, then he really, it's almost like a correspondence. When one memorizes the poem, one thinks the poem, one becomes the poem. But, anyways, I will continue with my interpretation of this poem. So Emily Dickinson uses the line "slant of light." We've all experienced this slant of light before, and typically this comes during midday, right? When as the sun is declining and the moon is beginning to show itself slowly. She says winter afternoon, so you get a hint that it's already midday, that the sun is turning on itself. And she uses the word that oppresses, like the heft of cathedral tunes. I mean, if we look like a if we look at it more like a childlike way, you could say that the end of a good day is ultimately very um, painful, right? You don't want the day to end, and so that's why Emily Dickinson uses the word "it oppresses," right? So the light is pushing down on you, and even when she says heavenly hurt it gives us, where we find no scar. Finding no scar, but internal difference, right? This would mean it's all the manifestation of this pain is almost strictly psychological. And then the line goes where the meanings are. There's a double play here where the pain and the despair lies in itself within us, and at the same time the meaning lies within us, not outwardly. And you get this idea because the very next line after that, she says, none may teach it any. 'Tis the seal despair, right? It's sealed with despair. An imperial affliction sent us of the air. I like this idea of it's such a highly manifestation of despair that it literally sent us of the air. I almost get the illusion that one is falling from the sky. And I really do feel like this metaphor really would help some people understand the poem, because it really seems to be like a symbolic falling where one is so high into the to you know the ideal of what is heavenly. Maybe this is a death of something that you love, or a death of something else, where the heavenly thing turns on you and it oppresses you and it leads you to your death, but in a more symbolic way. She talks about, then when it comes, the landscape listens. The way I think about this is, if one falls and hits the ground, right, which would be the landscape, it echoes, right? So when it says, when it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. A shadow holding its breath. It's too paradoxical, really, because a shadow is already dead, yet it's holding its breath. To me, this is such a beautiful thing, the way it's written, because to me, it shows the heavenly tragedy when one tries to cling so hard to something, to such a heavenly ideal or a heavenly projection of something that they thought was beautiful, but then it turns against them. And when they're still holding on, it's no longer really life affirming. It becomes life denying, like a shadow holding its breath, right? And only when one lets go of this, that you finally see the death itself, right? And says, and when it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. This play of distance and death, where the heavenly hurt is so near to you, it it causes so much agony that finally letting go, resulting in a death, it goes away into the distance. That, to me, there's a sort of beauty in that releasement, the releasement of the breath of the shadow, which was already dead in the first place. Anyways, I've begun memorizing this poem, and I think there's much benefit to memorizing this poem, or memorizing a poem that maybe appeals to you, a poem that maybe pulls you and you don't know why it pulls you, but you want to understand it more. If you begin to memorize the poem, slowly it reveals itself to you, and it reveals something about you. And in many ways, you possess the poem and the poem possesses you. There's something very beautiful about memorizing the poem. There is a sort of dialect and exchange that goes with this poem. The poem almost comes alive and it shows you something that you don't know. But anyways, I hope that this will be a benefit to those that don't know or have never taken seriously the memorization of a poem. Of course, my interpretation is strictly personal to myself, but I think it's ultimately very eye-opening, and you can make a poem made by a poet very personal to you when you decide to memorize it, because then it sort of goes above, it transcends even the mechanical memorization when the poem reveals something about you to yourself, that even though the poem is universal, it particularizes, right, to the individual. Anyways, that's enough of my my ranting. I hope that this will prove beneficial, and maybe like Harold Bloom, I can provoke people to revive the act of memorizing poems so that you can really know what it means to live like a poem and understand yourself in a better way. All right. See you guys.